Hi, welcome to the third tutorial of our session 5. We're discussing about how to write a literature review. In session 5, we discussed a 5-step approach. Step number 1, planning. Step number 2, reading. Step number 3, analyzing. Step number 4, drafting or writing. And the final step is revising your literature review. In our tutorial 1 and 2, we have covered planning, reading and analyzing, and now we will look at the fourth step, drafting. Drafting means writing your literature review. When you write your literature review, we need a structure. And what we have highlighted in yellow is a suggested or a typical structure that you can use for your literature review. Typically, it starts with an introduction, and then you find the main body of your literature review, which can be broken down into few topics. Then at the end, you have the conclusion followed by your list of references. So this framework can provide you a good guideline how to organize and write your literature review. So let's look at introductions. A good introduction is very important for a literature review because it makes it more interesting to read the rest of the literature review. Typically in an introduction, you find the overall scope of the literature review. What are you planning to achieve? You could also provide a little bit of background to your research, like the business problem, the research problem, and the research question, and what are you attempting to achieve. You could also include the importance or the rationale for your research very briefly. In some cases, you see that they make a very bold claim to make the literature review very interesting. Also, you find in an introduction the overall map or the structure of your literature review to say the body will contain these type of topics, and finally we will have a conclusion. On the right hand side, you see an example of a introduction, and interestingly it ends with a question, creating more interest for the reader to continue. The second section is organizing the main body of your literature review. There are many ways of organizing this body. Topical, distance to close, the type of debate, chronological order, or based on the seminar or seminal study. The most common one is the topical structure, where you break the body of your literature review into few topics. The topical structure is particularly useful and very simple to follow. Let's take an example. We were discussing about multicultural project themes and project quality. So if you take that research title, you can break your research body into 3 areas. First, discussing about multicultural project teams. So you bring a good description about multicultural project teams under this heading. The second topic can be project quality, where you discuss about project quality in detail. Then the third topic can be a discussion on the impact of multicultural project teams on project quality. This is where you combine the two concepts and bring about a discussion. The topical structure is also useful to bring large amount of literature and arrange it under a few topics which are very clear for the reader to follow. So that's one area of drafting, and now let's look at conclusions. What is a conclusion? Conclusion is all about summarizing or bringing the main idea of the literature review to a close. On the right hand side, you see an example of a conclusion which you can read and find how the research has been brought to a very neat and brief summary. So that brings us to the close of drafting and writing the literature review. And now let's look at revising. Now, this is where you have written your literature review once, and now you can go back and revise. Introduction. Does it have the impact I require, and is it appropriate? Next is the body. Have I organized it clearly? Is it simple and clear for a reader to follow? Transitions. Is my movement from one topic to another and one section to another, is it logical and can somebody follow? And finally, how is my conclusion? Does it provide a very strong and a very impactful closure? And don't forget to look at your spellings and grammar and do any corrections at this point. So that brings us to the close of the 5 areas we discussed about planning, reading, analyzing, drafting, and revising your literature review. Finally, let's look at the summary of your literature review. It's always good to have the big picture in mind. What is my overall journey, or what is my overall story of this literature review? By this time, you have read quite a lot of material, and there is a tendency to bring all this material into your literature review. Resist that temptation and only bring what is relevant to build your story. Otherwise, you find that your literature review is not well connected and there are so many distractions in your literature review. Always keep in mind the research question. Why am I doing this piece of literature review? Am I answering partly that research question? Can the reader follow my literature review very clearly? You will find 2 articles in additional reading section. Please go through them and get an understanding how literature reviews are written. It will help you to identify and get some tips about literature reviews. The next step is to do a small group exercise. Get into teams of 3 to 4 students, and you will find in the assessment folder some examples of past literature reviews. Look at one academic poster and a literature review in terms of the 5 aspects of the literature review: planning, reading, analyzing, drafting, and revising. Discuss about the positives and areas for improvement in the literature review and the academic poster. How many marks will you award for each? Discuss this as a group. Finally, we come to the session summary. In this session 5, we discuss mainly about how to write a literature review and the 5-step process. And we also looked at 4 ways of analyzing the literature: summarize, synthesize, compare, and critique. And finally, we looked at how to develop a literature review and present a very coherent and a very effective literature review. In the additional reading section, there is a knowledge test that you can do. Try to answer those questions and then look at the answers later. It will tell you whether your understanding about literature reviews are very good. So, all the best.